Comment on the video, where are people watching, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Elena's day began in a way that she could never have imagined. As the first rays of morning light seeped gently through her window, an eerie disturbance shattered the stillness of her small apartment. Instead of the peaceful silence she cherished at dawn, Elena was rudely awakened by an unsettling symphony, rapid flashes of blue and red light dancing across her ceiling and the resonant, insistent sound of knocking at her door. Her heart pounded as she struggled to reconcile these intrusive signals with the tranquility that usually greeted her each day. The flashing lights, so vivid and persistent, seemed to transform her familiar surroundings into an otherworldly stage. Confused and still rubbing sleep from her eyes, Elena lay in bed trying to decipher the meaning behind these startling interruptions. Was it a malfunctioning alarm? Had she been forgotten by the world of order that she so depended on? The knocking, too, was far from a gentle summons. It was urgent, its rhythm almost frantic, as if insisting that she must immediately face an unexpected crisis. With trembling hands, Elena reached for her nightstand lamp and flipped on a small reading light. Shadows danced on the walls as she sat in silence for a few heartbeats, letting the shock subside just enough to muster the courage to get up. Each step toward the door was measured and deliberate. The soft creak of the hardwood floor underfoot, the faint whiff of dawn's cool air through an open window, and the steady pulse of her own apprehensive heartbeat accompanied her as she reached for the door handle. In that moment, Elena's inner world shifted from one of cozy solitude to being fully aware of the uncertain reality that lay just outside. Peering through the peephole, she caught glimpses of silhouettes and distant movements that hinted at a presence she could neither ignore nor fully comprehend. The sight of those sporadic flashing lights, even from afar, sent a wave of dread through her. For someone who adored her quiet life and the comforting predictability of each routine morning, this was nothing short of a shock. Even as her mind scrambled for explanations, Elena steeled herself to open the door. What had once been a secure space dedicated to personal solace was now intruded upon by a sudden and mysterious crisis. In that fragile early hour, as the world outside seemed to be demanding immediate attention, Elena felt both vulnerable and determined. The promise of uncovering the truth behind this disconcerting awakening pushed her to step forward into an unfolding story that was already rewriting the rules of her ordinary life. With a deep inhalation that helped steady her racing heart, Elena finally opened the door to confront the source of the disturbance. What she found on her modest front porch was startling. There, arranged in a neat line under the early morning sky, were 4 uniformed officers, their presence as imposing as it was unexpected. Among them, one officer in particular drew her attention, a man with a prominent mustache and a determined glint in his eyes who clutched a clipboard as though it were both shield and key to the mystery. The officer's attire, crisp and impeccably maintained, contrasted sharply with the intimate familiarity of Elena's quiet neighborhood. Their stern expressions and measured stances communicated an air of official duty that could not be ignored. In the cool light of dawn, the seriousness in their eyes hinted at matters that reached far beyond a simple miscommunication. As Elena stood in the doorway, she felt a complex stir of emotions. Anxiety mingled with curiosity as she tried to process the situation. Questions raced through her mind. Why would these officers come to her door so early? What kind of emergency had jolted her peaceful morning into chaos? And what could be so urgent as to require a full contingent of law enforcement on her doorstep? The mustached officer, whose name tag Elena could barely glimpse through the low-hung brim of his cap, stepped forward and spoke in a calm, measured tone. His words, though not yet fully clear to her, carried the weight of official business, suggesting that what was happening had been planned long before Elena ever stirred in her bed. The clipboard in his hand, filled with documents and possibly orders, hinted at a sequence of decisions taken by those higher up in the chain of command. The air between them was thick with unspoken tension as the officers maintained a respectful but unwavering formation. Elena, still in a state of mild shock, struggled to find her voice and respond appropriately. The contrast between her expected morning routine and this extraordinary intrusion was jarring, yet a part of her recognized that this was a pivotal moment, one that could reshape the day in ways she had not foreseen. Determined not to be swept away by panic, Elena steadied herself and invited the officers inside for a brief conversation. As she stepped aside to allow them entry, the atmosphere became charged with the realization that her peaceful sanctuary had been breached by something far beyond the mundane. With the officers now in her living space, every detail in the room, the worn rug, the familiar photos on the walls, and even the soft hum of her refrigerator, seemed to underscore the vulnerability of a once-ordered life now disrupted by unforeseen circumstances. Inside Elena's modest living room, the tension grew heavier as the officers gathered in a tight semicircle. The mustached officer, still gripping his clipboard, took a step forward. His voice, steady and devoid of unnecessary emotion, broke the silence with news that Elena had never dreamed would be part of her morning routine. "We are here to enforce an eviction," he declared, his tone both clinical and resolute. Elena's mind raced as she tried to grasp the weight of his words. The officer's statement was accompanied by a meticulous list of reasons, each reason a dissection of her once peaceful existence. According to the official report, Elena's property had been found in violation of strict community standards set by the local homeowners association. Among the charges were the display of what they termed excessive decorative yard items, the use of an unapproved facade color that clashed with community ordinances, and multiple complaints about noise disturbances reported by her neighbors. Elena listened, bewilderment flooding her senses, as the officer continued outlining the supposed infractions. Each accusation felt surreal. How could her modest collection of handcrafted garden ornaments, the personal hue she had lovingly chosen for her front door, and the occasional sound of her late-night reading be grounds for eviction? The list of violations read like a litany of petty grievances, meticulously catalogued and weaponized against her hard-earned right to live as she pleased. The officer's clipboard, now a symbol of bureaucratic rigidity, represented the uncompromising authority of rules that seemed designed to control every minute aspect of personal expression. As he recited the details of the eviction order, Elena's thoughts turned to the delicate balance between community order and individual freedom. Was her home to be sacrificed at the altar of regulation? Was the voice of a community, enforced by such draconian measures, truly the guardian of everyone's interests? With each additional grievance read aloud, Elena felt increasingly cornered, not just by the impending threat of eviction, but by the abstraction of the rules that had suddenly taken on the power to uproot her life. The officer explained that the eviction order had been issued by the local Community Oversight Board, whose decisions, though wrapped in a veneer of legality, left little room for personal circumstance or explanation. It was as if every element of her home and personal style had been scrutinized and judged against a rigid standard that allowed no exceptions. The solemnity of the moment deepened as the implications of the order sank in. Elena, who had long taken pride in maintaining a home that reflected her personality, now found herself facing a fate dictated by a board of anonymous regulators. Her modest haven was under threat because of a series of seemingly minor deviations from the norm. The official, his tone unyielding, delivered the final line: she had 48 hours to vacate the premises unless these violations were remedied immediately, an ultimatum that felt both abrupt and unjust. In that charged living room, as Elena absorbed the barrage of accusations, she was forced to confront the stark reality of the situation. The very essence of her home, a place of comfort, creativity, and individuality, was now entangled in an overzealous interpretation of community rules, leaving her with a profound sense of injustice and uncertainty about the future. As the shock of the eviction announcement reverberated through Elena's living room, a sound at the doorway signaled a dramatic shift in the unfolding crisis. In a blur of motion and urgency, the door swung open, and in strode Damien, Elena's older brother and a dedicated law enforcement officer in his own right. Unlike the stiff demeanor of the uniformed officers already present, Damien's appearance was disheveled and decidedly human. He arrived in his worn pajamas, a stark contrast to the meticulous uniforms of those enforcing the order. Damien's sudden entrance caused a palpable shift in the room's energy. His eyes, still bright with the remnants of sleep but quickly sharpening with purpose, immediately focused on the eviction papers held by the mustached officer. With an arched brow and a tone that combined both disbelief and resolute authority, he demanded clarification on the legal basis of the eviction. "What is the meaning of this?" he barked, his voice echoing through the space as he stepped toward the cluster of officers. The officers paused, their disciplined formations momentarily disrupted by Damien's uncompromising presence. The contrast was stark. On one side stood the cold, procedural embodiment of community regulations, and on the other, a brother fiercely protective of his family's rights. Damien's insistence was not merely an expression of sibling love, but a challenge to a system that, in his eyes, had overstepped its bounds. He had seen too many cases where bureaucratic overreach strangled the personal freedoms of hardworking citizens. "Explain, now," Damien demanded, directing his gaze specifically at the mustached officer. "On what grounds have you taken such drastic measures against my sister? Your so-called violations, excessive decorative objects, an unapproved color on the front door, and noise complaints, are these truly sufficient to justify an eviction?" His tone was a blend of incredulity and controlled fury. As he spoke, Damien's words painted a picture of a system that was more interested in enforcing arbitrary aesthetic standards than in ensuring community safety and well-being. Inside the room, Elena could hardly keep pace with the rapid escalation. Her heart pounded in her ears as she watched her brother scrutinize every detail of the eviction order. Damien's eyes flicked from the paper in his hands to the faces of the officers, each glance laden with unspoken accusations and demands for accountability. The scene had transformed from a quiet domestic space into a makeshift courtroom, with Damien standing at the helm, a lone advocate for justice against a tide of impersonal regulations. In his casual attire, yet with a commanding presence that belied the softness of his pajamas, Damien began to dissect the documentation. The officers fumbled for words, caught off guard by his deep familiarity with both the law and the intricate details of community oversight. He questioned the legitimacy of the fines and the procedural accuracy of the eviction order. His arguments were methodical, combining legal precedents with a clear moral stance. That no family, no matter how modest their quirks, should be evicted for failing to conform to a sterile, bureaucratic ideal. The tension in the living room rose to a fever pitch. Every word Damien uttered struck a chord with Elena, reinforcing the belief that their home was more than a collection of superficial standards. In that intense moment, the room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the inevitable response from the officers. Their silence, punctuated only by the shuffling of papers and exchanged glances, spoke volumes about the fragility of their authority in the face of familial defiance. For Elena, witnessing her brother's passionate defense was both a comfort and a call to action. It was clear that Damien was ready to challenge the very foundations of the order that threatened her home. His unwavering stance and deep sense of justice transformed the living room into a battleground where personal rights clashed with the cold precision of bureaucratic rule. As he continued to press the officers for answers, one could sense that this confrontation was only the beginning of a long and arduous battle, a battle in which the love for family and the belief in individual dignity would guide every argument and every decision. Damien's critical examination of the eviction papers soon revealed an astonishing twist that added yet another layer of absurdity to an already surreal ordeal. With the papers spread out before him, he discovered that the eviction notice was not issued by a faceless bureaucrat, but bore the unmistakable signature of Veronica Kensington, the high-handed president of the Community Oversight Board. Even more preposterous, the document was notarized by an unlikely entity, her own pet cat, Mr. Whiskerson. The room fell silent as Damien's voice cut through the tension. "This document," he declared, "is a sham. Not only is it riddled with arbitrary accusations, but it bears the mark of absurdity. A notarization that, in any rational system, should not be legally binding." His words reverberated in the space, each syllable challenging the legitimacy of a process that Elena had once taken for granted. For Elena, the revelation was devastating. The realization that someone as influential as Veronica Kensington could manipulate community regulations, and do so with such outlandish methods, was almost too much to bear. Veronica's signature on the eviction notice was a reminder of the unchecked power that governed her quiet neighborhood. And the notarization by Mr. Whiskerson, a detail so ludicrous that it bordered on farce, only served to undermine the credibility of an already contentious order. Damien's tone grew sharper as he continued his investigation. He scrutinized every line of the document, pointing out errors and inconsistencies that revealed the depth of the fraud. "This is not about maintaining community standards," he asserted forcefully. "It's about control. A means for the board to impose their will on those who dare to express individuality." His words resonated with the passion of someone fighting not just for a single home, but for the very principle of personal freedom against an overreaching authority. The officers, who had earlier displayed an unyielding adherence to their orders, now exchanged uncertain looks as Damien's arguments gained momentum. The absurdity of having a pet cat signature as legal validation underscored the notion that the eviction order was nothing more than a tool of fraud and intimidation. Every detail, every superficial violation listed on the paper, now seemed designed to justify an eviction that had no real basis in fairness or law. Elena, standing at the edge of the confrontation, felt a mix of anger, sadness, and determination. The idea that her sanctuary could be threatened by such an outrageous abuse of power was deeply personal. In that heated moment, the eviction order ceased to be a paper document. It had become a symbol of an arbitrary system that prized uniformity above all else, even at the cost of human dignity and creative expression. Damien's challenge to the officers grew louder and more resolute. He demanded that they explain the legal basis for accepting such a dubious document. "If this is the standard by which our community is governed," he declared, "then what hope do we have for justice when every sign of individual flair is stamped out by nonsensical bureaucracy?" His words wove together legal insight and impassioned advocacy, painting a picture of a system that was both oppressive and ripe for change. The revelation about Veronica Kensington and her farcical notarization sent shockwaves through the room. The very foundation of the eviction order was under siege, leaving the officers scrambling to reconcile their orders with the evident fraud before them. Amid the mounting pressure, Damien's steady gaze and unwavering resolve served as a beacon of hope for Elena and for everyone who believed that rules should serve the people, not subjugate them. In that charged moment, as papers fluttered and voices rose, it became clear that the battle against this fraudulent eviction was just beginning. With every word and every challenge thrown by Damien, the room transformed into a tribunal of truth, a place where the absurdity of unchecked power would be called into question, and where the fight for justice would be waged with both passion and legality. With the fraudulent nature of the eviction notice laid bare before everyone's eyes, Damien's next move was swift and uncompromising. Refusing to allow the institution of deception to stand, he turned his full attention to the officers present. His voice, firm and resolute, commanded the room as he addressed the uniformed contingent. "These orders are a sham," he pronounced, eyes locked on the mustached officer, "and I insist that you leave immediately before you entangle yourselves in an act of fraud." Damien's words, imbued with both legal authority and personal indignation, cut through the lingering uncertainty like a sharp blade. He cited the clear violations of procedural integrity evident on the eviction notice, emphasizing that the absurd notarization by Mr. Whiskerson not only nullified the document's credibility but also amounted to criminal misrepresentation. With precise articulation, he threatened the officers with serious legal repercussions if they continued to enforce an order that was rooted in falsity. The officers, who had initially presented themselves as unwavering executors of the board's demands, now found themselves caught in a moral and legal quandary. Their eyes darted between the document in Damien's hands and the determined expression on his face. It was clear that the very foundation of their authority was slipping away in the wake of such a blatant abuse of power. "I will not stand idly by while my sister's home is compromised by fraudulent practices," Damien continued, his voice rising steadily, "and I will ensure that every ounce of misrepresentation is exposed to the full extent of the law." As the tension peaked, the room seemed to vibrate with the power of Damien's challenge. Elena watched with a mixture of awe and apprehension, knowing that her home, and the principle of individual rights, depended on her brother's willingness to confront the oppressive machinery of the community board head-on. The officers, now visibly unsettled, began to murmur among themselves. The facade of unquestioned authority had crumbled, leaving them exposed and vulnerable to the very legal scrutiny they had once taken for granted. Damien meticulously detailed the legal precedents and procedural missteps that rendered the eviction order null and void. His words, grounded in both personal conviction and professional expertise, left little room for dissent. With each pointed remark, he reminded the assembled officers, and, by extension, everyone present, that the law was not a tool to be manipulated by those in power, but a shield for the innocent and the marginalized. Furthermore, Damien cautioned them that any further involvement in the enforcement of this fraudulent eviction would not only implicate them in a scheme of deceit, but would also force the hands of judicial authorities to intervene decisively. His warnings were not idle threats but promises backed by the weight of legal precedents and a deep commitment to fairness. "If you persist in this charade," he declared, "I will ensure that those responsible face charges, and that my actions today set a precedent against such institutional corruption." For several long moments, silence reigned in the room as each officer contemplated the gravity of Damien's words. The energy of the confrontation shifted decisively, and one by one, the officers began to withdraw from Elena's home, their departure a silent acknowledgement of the untenable situation they found themselves in. The mustached officer lingered for a few heartbeats longer, his gaze full of conflicted duty, before he finally turned and exited with the others. In that moment, Damien's unwavering stance had not only forced the intruders to retreat but had also reasserted the fundamental rights of Elena, rights that could not be so casually stripped away by a rogue board and its misguided enforcers. As the door closed behind the departing officers, the charged atmosphere gradually began to dissipate, replaced by a resolute calm. Elena, whose wide eyes reflected both relief and lingering shock, stepped forward to embrace her brother. In that heartfelt reunion, the overwhelming message was clear: the fight for justice had only just begun, but with courage and truth on their side, no force, no matter how powerful, could silence the call for fairness. With the officers now withdrawn and the fraudulent eviction order in shambles, Damien resolved to take the struggle directly to the source. Clad in his official uniform, now a symbol of his authority and integrity, he prepared to visit Veronica Kensington, the controversial president of the Community Oversight Board. Veronica's name had long been whispered with a mix of reverence and resentment among residents, but today, her actions would be confronted head-on. Damien's journey to Veronica's imposing mansion was fraught with tension. Every step he took was measured, as he mentally prepared for the confrontation that lay ahead. The mansion, pristine and meticulously maintained, stood as a monument to the board's strict standards, yet it now felt more like a fortress built on the shaky foundations of deception. At the door, Damien paused to collect his thoughts, knowing that the outcome of this exchange could affect not only Elena's future but also the broader fabric of community governance. When the door finally swung open, Veronica Kensington appeared in an impeccably tailored suit. Her polished features and cool, collected demeanor suggested a woman who was no stranger to power. However, the moment her eyes met Damien's, a flicker of uncertainty passed over her face, an acknowledgement, perhaps, that her authority was being questioned in a way that left no room for polite evasions. "Mrs. Kensington," Damien began firmly, "I am here to address this fraudulent eviction order. Your signature, along with that farcical notarization by Mr. Whiskerson, has no legal merit." His words were measured yet carried the weight of absolute conviction. For a long moment, the two stared at each other, one representing the heart of community regulation and the other, the unwavering spirit of individual rights. Veronica's initial reaction was one of denial. She attempted to maintain her composed exterior, insisting that all protocols had been correctly followed and that the eviction was a necessary measure to preserve the standards of the community. Yet, when Damien mentioned the notarization by her pet cat, a detail that seemed ludicrous even to her, the facade began to crumble. Her words stumbled, and the polished veneer she had cultivated over the years started to show cracks. Damien pressed on without hesitation, laying out a clear case against the validity of the order. His discourse was both legal and moral. He explained that community regulations were meant to safeguard rather than oppress, and that the heavy-handed actions taken against Elena were emblematic of a system lost to its own pettiness. "Your actions," he said, "do not reflect the spirit of communal living, but rather an obsession with enforcing conformity at the expense of individuality." Each sentence was a measured strike against the very principles Veronica had sworn to uphold. As the dialogue deepened, Veronica's demeanor shifted from defensive to flustered. The pressure of Damien's incisive questioning and the mounting evidence of the order's fraudulent nature left her with little choice but to begin acknowledging the mistakes that had been made. In moments of near breakdown, she stammered apologies and offered tentative solutions, promising to rectify the misunderstandings and to work toward a more reasonable enforcement of community standards. Yet, even in her apology, there was an undeniable trace of desperation. Veronica's pleas to save face did little to erase the damage that had been inflicted by her actions. Damien, unwavering and resolute, made it clear that the matter would not be dismissed lightly. "I will hold you accountable," he warned, "not just for my sister's sake, but for every resident who has ever felt strangled by an unyielding bureaucracy." His words were a declaration, a call to reform the very system that had allowed such gross abuse of power. By the end of their confrontation, the atmosphere between them had shifted from one of hostile defiance to reluctant acquiescence. Veronica, having witnessed the force of Damien's argument and the undeniable evidence against her, reluctantly agreed to take measures to amend the wrongs. Though her apology was cautious and laden with political correctness, it signified the first step toward repairing the fractured trust between the board and the community. Damien left the mansion with a sense of hard-won victory tempered by the knowledge that this battle, while significant, was only one part of a larger struggle for justice in their community. His determination to protect Elena's rights and to challenge authoritarian overreach had ignited a spark of hope for change, even in the face of deeply entrenched power. After the tense confrontations and explosive revelations, the community was left to process the fallout from the fraudulent eviction ordeal. In a surprising turn of events, Veronica Kensington was compelled to face the public in a meeting of the Community Oversight Board. The meeting was held in the grand, yet now somber, Community Hall, a venue that had long been a symbol of the board's unwavering control but that now bore the marks of scandal and discontent. At the gathering, Veronica, with her posture slightly slumped, approached the podium. In front of a room filled with concerned and watchful residents, she delivered a formal apology for the wrongful eviction order issued against Elena. The apology, though measured and laden with the customary language of regret, did little to erase the deep-seated feelings of injustice. Her voice wavered as she acknowledged the absurdity of having an eviction notarized by her pet cat, Mr. Whiskerson, a detail that had catalyzed the outrage. For Elena, who had witnessed every step of the fiasco with a mix of disbelief and resolute hope, the public apology represented a bittersweet victory. While it did not undo the trauma of the past events, it signaled that the tide was turning against the draconian measures of the board. The community, which had suffered under the weight of unrealistic expectations and impersonal rules, now saw a glimmer of accountability in Veronica's reluctant contrition. In the aftermath of the meeting, Elena found a unique way to reclaim her narrative. With a touch of humor and personal defiance, she introduced a new garden ornament to her front yard, a whimsical gnome adorned with a tiny badge reminiscent of Damien's own uniform. This playful token of rebellion was not merely a symbol of personal triumph over bureaucratic abuse, it was also a subtle reminder that even in the face of institutional overreach, individual voices could rise to challenge injustice. Residents, many of whom had quietly supported Elena's plight, gathered around to admire the new gnome. Its cheerful presence, accented by the tiny badge, became an emblem of hope and resistance. Conversations buzzed with plans for further community action, and whispers of reform began to circulate more freely than ever before. For Elena, that day marked the beginning of a new chapter, a chapter in which she and her neighbors would no longer allow unjust authority to dictate their lives. The public apology, though a small gesture in the grand scheme of things, had set in motion a series of events that promised to reshape the dynamics of their community for the better. In the weeks following the public apology, Elena's life gradually began to settle into a fragile, yet hopeful new normal. The community's reaction to the events had been mixed, anger, relief, and cautious optimism intermingled in conversations that echoed throughout neighborhood gatherings and casual chats over coffee. Elena, buoyed by the support of friends and neighbors, embraced the sentiment that now, at long last, the oppressive rules of the past were yielding to a more compassionate and fair approach. Walking through her front yard, Elena admired the small garden gnome that she had proudly placed as a beacon of resistance. The gnome, complete with its playful badge, served as a silent manifesto against the absurdity of overzealous regulation. A testament to the idea that life's quirks and individuality were to be celebrated, not punished. Every time she glanced at it, Elena was reminded not only of her own strength in the face of injustice but also of the solidarity that had begun to unite her community. Neighbors, once cowed by the heavy hand of bureaucratic enforcement, now dared to speak out, share their stories, and demand meaningful change. Informal gatherings in community centers blossomed into spirited discussions about rights, art, and the value of self-expression. For Elena, this period of communal healing was also deeply personal. While the scars of the past weeks remained, they served as a reminder that truth and perseverance could eventually overcome even the most absurd challenges. She discovered new opportunities to engage with her community, both as a defender of her own modest home and as an advocate for reform in local governance. As the days turned to weeks, Elena's life began to take on the gentle, steady rhythm of a new dawn. The gnome, once a playful symbol of defiance, now shone as a marker of the community's resilience and the promise of a more just future. In every conversation and every shared moment, the seeds of change were being sown. And in that ongoing process of reclamation, Elena felt an enduring hope that the best was yet to come.